Well, hello BookTube, it's Roz and it's the 1st of January 2021 and a bit of a special day for me because it's the first anniversary of me having this channel scallydandling about the books on BookTube, and what a lovely year it's been. And I'm kind of going to celebrate it over this weekend, self-indulgently, with 3 videos, of which this is the first. The other 2, one's going to be about scallydandling, you know, my reading books from around the world and asking for your help in finding books from the kind of 38 to 45 countries I've got left. And one is going to be the now what's it called, the booktuber favorites tag, and I want to do that because it gives me a chance to thank and celebrate all the booktubers that I've shared the last year with. But today what I'm doing is, well, normally at the end of the month I do like a D&D video, delights and discoveries of that month's reading, but it being the very end of December or the beginning of January, instead I'm doing like a review of the highlights of my year's reading. Now, I have seen some very self-disciplined and yes, well-organised people out there who managed to do a top 10 from their year's reading, and I've tried, but I just can't do it. So instead, what I've done is I've gone for some categories, and I'm going to do like my top few in each of those categories. And yeah, I hope you'll indulge me with that. So I read 120 books this year. Well, finished 120. There's 2 books I've got still on the go. One is Milton's Paradise Lost, and the other is Dante's Divine Comedy, both of which are kind of long-term projects, but the other 120 done and dusted, so that's what I'm picking from. But I'm kind of excluding the books that I reread this year, because what's the point of putting, you know, Jane Austen's Emma up against, you know, other stuff that I read in any given year. But one of the highlights of my year was, in reading terms, I suppose, was my first proper tag that I did, which was the reread book tag 2020 version. And it's been such fun, everyone who's done that tag, and it really made me think about my rereading. And probably my top 2 rereads were Emma and Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons. But let's carry on. So I'm going to start with an easy category to choose my top 4, and that's non-fiction. Now, over the course of the year, let me see. I have a little book where I kind of write down what I read all year, and I do a bit of a tally of you know, how many different things. And I read 17 books of non-fiction. And top 2, one was a lovely book about writers, Square Haunting by Francesca Wade, and that was a delight because it was like a kind of book lover's book, yeah. But the other was a booktuber's book, because it was Unspeakable by Hannah Joyner and Susan Burch, and Hannah is Hannah of Hannah's Books. And it was a special pleasure because I read it with a group of other booktubers as a shared read. But it's a very, I would warmly recommend it as a book, but I won't say any more about it because there should be a video about it fairly soon if everything goes according to plan, kind of from the group and involving Hannah. So fingers crossed that will come soon. So that was non-fiction. Another category that's not too difficult to pick was plays. Now, I read a lot of plays this year in a kind of new development for me. I actually read 16, and part of the reason for that was that Tilly, that's my daughter Matilda of Tilly's Shelf, and I agreed that we would read a play every month and make a video about it, which we've done, and there's a playlist on this channel if you're interested at all. We'd also love it if other people would like to use the hashtag discussing drama and talk about plays sometimes too. It's really good fun reading a play. I hadn't really remembered what pleasure there could be from reading a play rather than, I thought plays are for seeing rather than reading, but actually it's quite interesting. Yeah. So my top two plays, one was Translations by Brian Friel, and so it's a modern play, Irish, political, but also about language and about love and loyalties and relationships. Yeah, gorgeous. And one that I didn't know, although Tilly did. My other top play, when I thought about it, was the very first one that I read this year. And it wasn't one that I did with Tilly. It was The Trojan Women by Euripides. And the reason I read that was because I read Natalie Haynes' book, A Thousand Ships. And it's one of those like retellings of Greek myths or Homer or the Iliad, that Iliad or the Odyssey. That's kind of it's quite a thing at the moment, isn't it? And I read A Thousand Ships, and it made me want to go back to the source material, I guess. So that was why I read Euripides and Trojan Women, and really enjoyed that. And it got me reading a few other Greek plays in the earlier part of the year too, which was a joy. So that's two easy categories. A third category that's reasonably easy is picking my favourite poetry of the year. Now, I read 13 collections of poetry or longer poems this year, and I've allowed myself to pick three, okay, because one is contemporary poetry, current stuff, came out this year. It's called A Portable Paradise, and it's by a poet called Roger Robinson, and he's like a British West Indian poet, and it kind of vied with Claudia Rankine's Citizen, an American lyric, for kind of top place for a contemporary book of poetry. But I picked the Roger Robinson because it's about the Black British experience and a kind of London experience, and so that spoke to me particularly powerfully. My kind of modern 20th century poetry choice of the year was one that was recommended by another booktuber, Mark Nash, and that's Transcript by Heimrad. And I'd really recommend Mark's video about it. I might try and find it and link to it in the description if I can. It's poetry about the Holocaust, and in some ways the Holocaust is an unspeakable thing to write about. And what Bakker does is he actually he writes he's writing about it in its own words. So it's found poetry, concrete poetry. He uses everything from railway timetables to graffiti to administrative orders, and finds in those words incredibly moving poems. Yeah, a real knockout book actually. My classical poetry choice is The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge. Now, it wasn't totally unfamiliar to me. I've read various bits of the Ancient Mariner, sort of off and on, the sort of thing that you get in anthologies as a child, just a few verses. But I've never felt the urge to read the whole thing. But this year, lovely kind of coronavirus lockdown project that happened miraculously. They must have planned it before, but yeah, brilliant. Was the Ancient Mariner project, and I will definitely link to that below because the videos are all there on YouTube if you want to go and watch them. What it was a project it broke the Ancient Mariner up into sections, and every section was read by a different reader, some actors, all sorts of different people. And for each section you also got an original artwork and a little bit of reflection, kind of inspired by those verses of the poem. So it kind of made it utterly digestible and a kind of multimedia experience, shall we say. Anyway, it brought the poem to life for me, and was a surprise success. So I will remember 2020 for that. So those are kind of like probably the easy categories to do. Now, I should, in theory, have a short stories category, but I read a few collections of short stories this year, and none of them really. I mean, I could pick the favourite of those, but it doesn't really belong in my year's highlights. Um, I'm not a short story reader. Maybe 2021 I'll discover the right kind of collections of short stories to to so that by this video in a year's time I'll have some to include. But yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Maybe people sometimes people have recommended some really good ones to me that I should try, I guess, and maybe that will happen. So we can move on to the main event, fiction. Now, I've split this up again a bit because I couldn't just pick. Yeah, it's the thing I love best, so it's what you're going to get most of. Okay. First category for me, I've split my fiction into, is books that were scallydandles, that were books, this thing that I do of reading books from a country where I've never read a book from someone from that place before. And this year, the books I read, those 120, came from 38 different countries. So I'm quite happy with that. Now, it's not. I like doing this because it gives me different perspectives, and yeah, I'll talk about that more in my scallydandling video that I'm going to make and put up this over this weekend as well. But yeah, I wanted to pick two favourites of those, and one of those is The Desert and the Drum. Now, that's a book from Mauritania. So that's a country that I don't really know, didn't know much about till I read this book. And the author's Mbarek Ould Beyrouk, and it was written in 2015 and translated by Rachel McGill. And it epitomises that scallydandling kind of project for me, in that it says somewhere that I don't know. It's an author who he's writing from a tradition and a set of stories and a culture and political situation and a history that are all unfamiliar to me, but in that novel I get a kind of a sense of that in a meaningful way. It's a lovely, tender little book. Yeah. My other pick for sort of top scallydandle, as it were, is a book that I read really early in the year, on 9th of January. There we go. And it's The Radiance of the King by Camara, Laye. And I've mentioned this book a few times this year, but it's one I can't recommend highly enough. It would have been one of my top books of the year if I had managed to do like a top 10 of any, from anywhere. Anyhow, that would have been in it. And he was from Guinea, and it was published in 1954, and it's quite kind of modernist, experimental, I guess. Really, well, I'll stop going on about it, but yeah, do read it. Do read it. That one, yeah. So that's one of my fiction subcategories, as it were. Second one I'm going to allow myself is older fiction. So I've sort of split into sort of contemporary and older, and I've even broken down older fiction a little, because I'm going to pick my two best sort of big beasts from the classics. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. I've never read Bleak House before. Isn't that extraordinary? I've got to 56 without reading Bleak House. Wonderful. Didn't quite pip our mutual friend from my top spot of Dickens, but it was a gorgeous book with a heroine, Esther Summerson, who I really appreciated because she is a sensible, caring, thoughtful, decent, straightforward woman who then gets to have a happy ending. Yeah. And my other sort of big beast was The Brothers Karamazov that I read right at the end of the year and pushed itself in as one of the year's highlights, as it were, Dostoevsky, obviously. Then, second sort of subgroup of older fiction is I read two kind of modernist classics this year, both of which I was sort of pulled into reading by BookTube. Thank you, BookTube. Um, uh, One of those was Ulysses, which I started kind of at the beginning of the year with the help of Alan of Big Hard Books and Classics and a lovely group of people in a group, Read on Voxer, and with Mark Nash and various others. And we kind of had to abandon it when the sort of the pandemic really struck because we just weren't in the right place for that sort of read. But I came back to it later in the year and finished it myself. And very special reading James Joyce. You don't forget your first reading of Ulysses, I think. Um, the other is The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner, and it's Brian of Bookish and Alan of Big Hard Books and Classics who got me to read that, as they do an annual Faulkner in August read, which, yeah, look out for it this coming August. Again, really enjoyable to do it as a group read, and a book that I got so much out of. In Crypto of Codex Cantina sort of took part this year, and that added another element to it. And yeah, that sort of book you get so much more out of, I think, in reading it in that way. Then two 20th century, middle of the 20th century women authors' books that absolutely belong in my sort of highlights of the year. One is I had to pick a Clarice Lispector. If you know this channel, you'd guess I would pick a Clarice Lispector. And the one I picked as my sort of favourite of the year was Agua Viva. Very, very special book. My other choice was a book that I came to read because of Britta and Mel's year of reading German books, and that was Gilgi by Irma Coyne. Gilgi, One of Us, I think yes, is the full title. And I did a video about that, so I won't go on about it, but just to say it was incredibly fresh for me for a book written in the middle of the 20th century. You could write it now, in a way, yeah. So that just leaves us with contemporary fiction, and I've allowed myself quite a few here, okay, so, but I'll do them all quite quickly. And all of these were written within the last sort of 7 or 8 years. I think the oldest was written in 2012 and the most recent are 2020 books. And these are in no particular order, yeah, but they're all books that will stick in my mind a long time, I think. One is Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. It was such a hyped book, I thought I might not love it, and then I did. Another is The Lost Children Archive by Valeria Luiselli, which was an early in the year book and was one that Mark Nash again enthused about me, and there's a bit of enthused about and got me to read. And there's a bit of a theme here because my next choice is actually Three Dreams in the Key of G by Mark, which was, yeah, a very memorable read of the year. Then I've got a little group of books that are all kind of historical fiction, but at the, oh, it's an awful phrase, but at the literary fiction end of historical fiction, if that makes sense. One was The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel, and the fun of reading that was the Cromwellathon at the beginning of the year, when a group of us read Wolf Hall, Bring Up the Bodies, and then The Mirror and the Light, and that book had one of the best endings of any book I've ever read. I have to remember, you know, when you do those tags and they, you know, it says, oh, you know, what book had a brilliant ending. That was, yeah, tears and, wow, yeah, even though I knew what was coming. Another in this sort of historical fiction kind of area was Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, and again, a bit of a hyped book. but actually turned out to be very tender and beautiful, and a book about grief, a mother's sort of bereavement, parents' bereavement, which yeah, and a book about plague, which seemed appropriate in this year. Yeah, yeah, kind of a better book than than I thought it was going to be. Although actually everything I've read by her has been good. And then the final one was another of my German books, and that's now. Oh, I should have remembered how to pronounce this, because it's spelt Till, Tyll, but and a kind person, might have been Madeline, made with books, told me how I was meant to pronounce that, and I've forgotten again. Tull, maybe, or Till, I don't know. Anyway, brilliant anarchic book about the 30 Years' War in Germany. That was almost kind of a bit magical realist, but not. Because you don't really have to make the 30 Years' War any more kind of extreme and crazy than it really was. Yeah, if you haven't read it, do. Another book that was definitely in the magical realist area was The Enlightenment of the Green Gage Tree, and this book set in Iran and about the Iranian Revolution, and told by a ghost, a teenage ghost. Again, a book that not everyone has loved this year, but I certainly did. Which brings me to another book that I loved and not everyone did, which was Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor. Yeah, I was surprised by how many people didn't like that book and thought it was just miserable, whereas I thought it was angry and intense. And then, thinking of angry and intense books, another book that was perhaps one of the few books on this list that technically wasn't a 5-star read, and yet it will stay with me in my head for a very long time, I think, and that's Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese. And it's a book about the sort of residential school system in Canada that ruined the lives and drastically damaged the culture of uh, Indigenous Canadian people. And it was about ice hockey as well, and I was just so amazed that I got so much out of a book that had so many descriptions of ice hockey matches in it. Yeah, you wouldn't think, would you? 2012. That's the oldest book in my sort of contemporary selection. Very well worth reading. And my final pick of contemporary fiction novels of the year, and my last kind of brilliant 5-star read, I suppose, was Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, and it's kind of a fantasy book, but I was going to say so much more than that, and then fantasy, people who love fantasy will be really offended. I don't mean it like that. It's just a wonderful, extraordinary book, or with a central conceit or idea that carries you along in a magical way, and it's like many of the best fantasy books, I suppose. It's about the meaning of human existence, I think, and how we understand ourselves and the world around us. There you go. So that was my year of books, and I think for a number of those I've forgotten to say the author or the translator or whatever. So I will put all of them in the show notes, as Jason of Byward in Bookland, now Jason Has Books, would call it. So I will do that, and Happy New Year, and there'll be another video tomorrow.